You got it. Start.
Hi, you're in.
Okay. I'm going to start with something that we mentioned today in the keynote. I give a little bit of commentary on the process, these traditional lamentations that we read on Tisha B'Av. One of them in particular refers to the cruelty of the Roman conquerors, the destruction in Beit HaMikdash, and it seems to be a pretty recurring theme that the cruelty was something unsurpassed, that it was terrible, that the tragedy was unspeakable. In particular, there's a reference. One of the keynote that we read this morning refers specifically to Nebuzaradan. Nebuzaradan was the Babylonian general, not the emperor, but the general, who was responsible for the actual destruction of the temple. Nebuchadnezzar was the emperor himself, and Nebuzaradan was his general. So the Gemara here makes it recounts what exactly happened. Very short passage, and then it makes a number of seemingly outrageous comments. We'll have to tackle this because it baffles the mind. We're used to thinking in terms of purely negative and death and destruction are god awful. Don't get me wrong. There's some very interesting aspects to this that really beg a little bit more explanation. So the Gemara explains that when Nebuzaradan entered Jerusalem, so the siege had finally given way. I mean, the city just couldn't take it anymore. So he enters the temple itself, and he enters the sanctuary. And as he enters the sanctuary, he sees the blood of Zechariah Navi, Zachary the prophet, who was murdered by the Jewish nation, people who were ferociously opposed to his critique and to his rebuke of the nation. They had brought already some idols and images into Beit HaMikdash. He gets up and he announces very clearly, unequivocally, the temple is going to be destroyed, what you're doing is terrible. On Yom Kippur, no less, he tells them this is, here's the situation, and he calls them to order. And effectively, not only does he get politely ignored, but he's murdered in cold blood. He was basically stoned and murdered. He wasn't the only one. Unfortunately, there are a number of prophets, Yirmiyah and Yeshaya, were also murdered. And in his case, the Gemara tells us something absolutely mind-boggling, that his blood continued to bubble on the floor of the sanctuary until the destruction. So Nebuzaradan enters into the sanctuary. The Gemara tells us this is Masechet Sanhedrin and Daf Tzadi Waw Mudbet, so 96b. The Gemara says that as he's walking in, the decree had already been given that Beit HaMikdash should be destroyed, that the nation should be captive, taken captive, enslaved, and exiled. And what does he see? He sees the blood of Yirmiyah Navi that's literally boiling on the floor, out of as a symbol of Hashem's rage over all of this. And so he said to the Kohanim that were present, "What is it exactly that's going on over here? What is this blood on the floor?" And they said, "Oh, it's the blood of sacrifices. Spilled some sacrificial blood. And we so often we get tired and you make a mistake." And he could tell they weren't telling him the truth. So he said, "Okay, I haven't seen sacrificial blood boil just yet, but let's give it a try. If what you're saying is true, I'm happy to entertain it." So he tried with a bull, he tried with a ram, he tried with a goat, and none of their bloods reacted accordingly. So he was a little bit troubled, and he could tell that they weren't being straightforward with him. Nothing resembled what was going on the floor. So he said, "Either you reveal to me what's going on over here, or I'm going to flay you." F-L-A-Y, it's a word that you should never hear again in English. It means literally to scrape someone's skin and flesh off while they're alive. Leave these things to ISIS and the Arab world today. This is not something that Jews ever engaged in, but this is one of the things that apparently the Romans were famous for. They would take these iron combs, basically iron combs with teeth. No, like a comb to comb your hair. No, the same kind of thing you use to comb your hair, but made of iron and with sharp edges. There was a way of torturing people, to giving you information or just torturing them for the fun of it, which apparently the Romans found very entertaining. Today we call it boxing. So Nebuzaradan threatened to kill the Kohanim who were present if they wouldn't explain to him what it was that had happened there. It's literally, they'll take out this iron comb and I will shred your flesh while you're still alive. And so they said to him, that's the blood of a Kohen, and who happened to be a prophet, and he prophesied for us as a nation about the destruction of the temple, and so we killed him. Because, of course, that's what you do when someone gives you constructive criticisms, you kill him. So he said, okay, no problem. If that's the case, I'm going to appease him. Like, I'm going to settle this rage. So he brought the sages, he brought the rabbis of Yerushalayim, slaughtered them over this blood, and the blood still refused to settle. And so he said he was going to bring the younger children, maybe they're not as learned, but at least they have innocence to them. This whole concept of innocence and sacrifice, we'll talk about it in a second. We'll bring the children instead, those the literally students, Tinakot de Bet Rabban, children who learn in schools by the rabbis. And he slaughtered quite a number of them over the blood, and it still refused to settle, to calm down. So he brought him what's called Pirhei Kehuna. These are the young children that are training to be Kohanim, training to do the service in Beit HaMikdash as Kohanim. He killed them over it, and it still refused to settle. And so how much was this? Do the calculation. Tishin Warba'a Ribo. So Tishin Warba'a Ribo, 49 times 10,000 is 490,000 people, right? This is a pretty impressive feat. In fact, if you look at some of the early Muslim conquerors, they prided themselves on numbers like this. Tamerlan, Yimach Zichro, I remember this when they announced the names of these Boston Marathon bombers.
Yeah.
And everybody was shocked. How can it be? They came to America, they got welfare, unemployment insurance, etc. So he was, Tamerlan, one of the guys the guy who died, who was killed by the police, was actually named after a Muslim conqueror who was made famous for capturing his opponents, capturing these enemy armies, people who he invaded, and decapitating all of them and making a pile of the heads so high that you couldn't see above it if you were standing on a horse. That was their pastime. This wasn't a new thing, that they named their son after a murderer. It's like everybody was shocked and surprised. How could he do such a thing, kill innocent people? He killed some people. His namesake did this professionally. So 490,000 people Nebuchadnezzar Radan happened to kill in Yerushalayim at this particular time, and the blood still didn't come, it didn't settle. So he approached it, and he screamed, he said, Zechariah, Zechariah, invoking the name of the prophet. Tovim shebahen ibadtim, I've already killed the best of them. I've already killed like the best of this nation that you prophesied for. Nihalach de'chtalinu lechulhu. Would you like for me to kill the rest of them until this blood-boiling ceremony comes to a conclusion? At this point, miyad nah, the blood settled, the blood calmed down. So apparently he had a squirt to settle with boiling blood, and he managed to pull it off. Here's where it gets even more bizarre. Hirher teshuvah b'da'ateh. Nebuchadnezzar Radan, realizing what it was that he just did, how he basically just killed an entire city, all of a sudden started having thoughts of teshuvah. Started thinking a bit along the lines of repentance. Amar, mahem shelo ibdu el nefesh achat. Kach, so if this is what their God, what God allowed to happen to them, after all they did was kill one person, so he was a Kohen, he was the Kohen Gadol at the time, he was the prophet. Hahu gavra metehu aleh. If they killed one Kohen and 490,000 of them, died as a result, and all of a sudden he realizes when sitting in this pool of blood, what it was that he did. That man, he's referring to himself, what's going to happen to me if I killed 500,000 of them? I mean, I imagine my punishment's going to be worse than what happened to them. Arak. So he ran away. After destroying Beit HaMikdash and killing all these people, he ran away. Shadar protita lebete v'itgayar. Right? So he sent an agent or an emissary to his home, and he converted. Because of course, this is what you do after you kill 500,000 people, is you adopt their religion. I mean, this mildly bizarre.
The story becomes more and more bizarre each pasuk.
As every stage passes, right? This is a little bit difficult for us to digest. First of all, we're told that the murder, the spilling of the blood, It's catastrophic. It's, that part of the story we're familiar with. What on earth drives such a deranged individual to go ahead and convert? And of all things, tell me he found God, or he wants to be a born again, whatever. Converting specifically to the very religion that he just gutted. I mean, that he just decimated. This makes any sense at all? And then I have a personal rabbinic question, maybe not in the fridge, we'll put it in the freezer, discuss it some other time. I'd like to meet the Beit Din that sponsored this conversion. I know people come from all kinds of backgrounds, and it's not an easy process. I don't know, RCA, I don't know if it was Lakewood, I don't know if it was the Israeli rabbinate. I'm just out of sheer curiosity. The old line used to be, I'd like to meet his tailor. I don't know. Someone comes to me and says, listen, Rabbi, no offense, I loved you. Some of my best friends are Jewish. The 500,000 people that I killed woke up on the wrong side of the bed. It's not me anymore. I've now reformed myself. I'm a different man than I was back then. So I'm curious to meet the Beit Din that converted him, but effectively he was converted, and conversion requires a Beit Din, so must have found 3 rabbis that believed him to be a legitimate, genuine candidate for conversion, with every intention of observing the Torah and the mitzvot that he had practically extinguished, that he practically stamped out. Well, not to be outdone, the Gemara gives us a very curious list of famous converts from back in the day. This isn't the Sesame Street, Disney candy-coated version of nice people who are successful, poets, musicians, historians, scientists. No, this is a little bit more complicated. So Gemara goes on to the Braita that teaches us Naaman. So he was actually a righteous Gentile. Nebuzaradan, Ger Tzedekaya. Nebuzaradan, on the contrary, was not a righteous Gentile, in other words, who observed the 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments, of which murder is definitely one of the more prominently featured. Nebuzaradan was a Ger Tzedek. He literally converted, and he led an observant life. Wonder how easy it was to get a minyan together, but he pulled it off. מבני בניו של סיסרא למדו תורה בירושלים, the Gemara tells us. From the descendants, בני בניו literally means the grandchildren, or like the descendants of Sisera, they studied Torah in Yerushalayim. Meaning not only were they observant, as if to say Nebuzaradan has now been one-upped, he's been outdone. Because he himself, he was an observant guy, don't get me wrong, but was he teaching Torah is what I want to know. Because if he wasn't teaching, Sisera and his descendants were teaching, not Sisera himself, but his descendants, we're teaching Torah in Yerushalayim, which is pretty impressive because it's not like, again, after the destruction, the city was rebuilt, but this is even before the destruction. We had no shortage of qualified teachers. There was no shortage of sages, of rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim, capable of teaching, and nonetheless, apparently his descendants were right up there, front and center. The Bnei Banav shel Sancheriv, right? So Sancheriv, the famous wicked individual, who caused all of the nations of the world to get mixed up, kind of inextricably. In other words, the fact that today we don't have anyone in the category of Amalek, we don't trace anyone's genealogy back to Egypt or to Edom, Ammoni, Moabi. There are some nations that have complicated situations associated with them and halachic consequences to them. For example, the Ammoni and Moabi men aren't accepted as converts, the women are. Ruta Moaviyah was one of them, and so the Davidic dynasty begins with quite an exceptional convert, that as a woman she would be accepted, as a man they would be accepted as converts, but they'd have this perpetual status of like mamzerim because of their spiritual genes. Happen to be especially wicked nations. So Sancheriv was the Babylonian general who decided intentionally to kind of mix up the nations of the world for what appear at very least to be very evil purposes. And nonetheless, from his descendants, they taught Torah in public. So it wasn't just a small class that someone managed to find 2 or 3 followers. These were public Torah classes. The Gemara goes on and it interjects, because this is a Braita that predates the Gemara. The Gemara says, Umanin, who are these descendants of Sancheriv? Shmai Abdal Talyon. If you're familiar with these are some of the greatest sages of all time. Just by sheer coincidence, happen to be descended of the general who scattered the entire Jewish nation into diaspora. The first time the 10 lost tribes, the famous lost tribes, were lost by him. He was the one who did this with his own 2 hands. The subject of quite a bit of dispute. It I mean, maybe not. Will they ever be re-identified and brought back into the Jewish nation intact? So, just a little footnote. Some of the greatest of our sages happen to be descended of Sancheriv, which is impressive. מבני בניו של המן למדו תורה בבני ברק. I've been to Bnei Brak, I've ever heard about it. It happens to be certainly to the state, maybe not where it's located historically, it's a good few miles off. But nonetheless, from the descendants of Haman, they were studying Torah in Bnei Brak. It's a very cute and funny joke that a lot of little kids tell when they don't like their Rebbe in Bnei Brak. But the reality is, the Gemara tells us, this is how it was. Haman's descendants ended up teaching Torah in Bnei Brak, which was a bastion of Torah study at the time of the Mishnah. Haman. What are you making faces for?
No, I didn't ever heard.
Right, so it sounds a little bit strange, right?
Although it's like from his, well, like his, like, in the Kila it says all the kids' names.
10 of his sons were
I
hanged.
guess because you're saying they're the other ones. That
They didn't hang his grandchildren.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But his descendants.
Bnei Banav literally means his son's son, but it refers
Okay.
his descendants, like further on.
Further down.
Haman, don't forget, is at the very end of the exile between the two Batei Mikdash, the two temples. So it was a 70-year exile. The story begins like at the very end of year 68, 69, which they had misread to be year 70. They have this whole plan. It goes around basically one calendar year, one cycle. At the conclusion, he's killed. Esther requests, and her request is granted, that his 10 sons should be hanged. But we're told, the Midrash says he had a daughter who committed suicide, and that apparently his grandchildren were unharmed. In other words, as guilty as he was, and apparently his sons were active in their father's business, his grandchildren survived. So, the descendants of Haman taught Torah in Bnei Brak. Again, because of course, why not? Hated people, genocidal maniac, but doesn't disqualify him from teaching. He can certainly find a job in any American university today. Why would this disqualify him from teaching Torah? So the Gemara goes on and it says, "Va'af mibnei banav shel oto rasha," and even from the descendants of that unspecified rasha, meaning a said evil individual whose name will go unmentioned, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, meaning the general, the one who actually ordered the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, which seems to say that he's even worse off than Nebuzaradan, who was actually there. Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'achnisan tachat kanfei HaShekhinah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, almost made it such that he should be brought under the wings of the Shekhinah, and as if to say it would have happened. Amru malachei hasharet lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the archangel said before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel olam, mi shehachariv et beitecha v'saraf et heichalecha, tachnis tachat kanfei HaShekhinah. They said, as if to say, the angels protested. Master of the world, can it be that the one who literally destroyed your house and who burned your sanctuary, you're going to allow him to come, seek shelter under the wings of the divine presence of the Shekhinah? Hanu dichtiv, and this is the pasuk that we read, Rafinu et Bavel v'lo nirpata. As if to say, we tried to ease up on Babylonia, and it didn't happen. Meaning, he almost made it in, and he didn't. So the discussion, how we understand the pasuk, we understand it referring to Nebuchadnezzar. So, all right. I mean, it's food for thought. You'd wonder why someone crazy and genocidal would be inclined to learn or teach Torah in the first place. I'd be a little bit more curious as to why, how people responded or reacted to this, and then let alone to master the Torah in such a way, or at least their descendants, we should be a little bit more historically accurate. So why their descendants would be so deeply connected to Torah that it's not even enough just to observe it. It's not even enough to teach about it. There has to be something much deeper going on over here. And the Gemara ends right there. That's it. As far as this discussion is concerned, it's just good things to know. So
It doesn't give a conclusion or anything.
no, there are no conclusions. Gemara, it's an open book. There's a lot of untied loose ends that we have to kind of weave together when you're studying Gemara, and it's intentionally this way. If you remember, we studied in Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. He writes in the introduction to the book something fascinating. He says, look, I know I have no business writing this in a book. I know that it's inevitable that all kinds of imbeciles and psychopaths are going to get a hand on whatever it is that we commit to print. Anybody can pick up a book and open it and study and teach whatever they want. And they're going to misinterpret things, they're going to judge me unfavorably, they're going to try to compare and contrast to different Jewish and non-Jewish thinkers. And so he said, first of all, please judge me favorably. Trust me, I went over this book a number of times before I published it. Second of all, I said, don't worry, I made it hard. I started something here and I finished it over there, and I asked a question here, but the real answer is over there, and I kind of fake left and go right, and I made it difficult to follow intentionally so that these secrets only end up in the hands of the people who have the intellectual, maybe philosophical capability to digest these thoughts, to look for answers, not to settle for relatively easy, quick, made in China kind of responses. Really look, dig deep and try to find the answers to the questions you're asking. So the Gemara is very much this way. He's basically following the Talmud. The Gemara will mention something in some place and then kind of touch on it somewhere else. It'll open a chapter and not close it. It'll fake left, go right, hand off, fumble. It seems like Chazal, a random stream of associations when they're thinking, but the reality is far from it, as we'll hopefully see. When I was studying German in NYU, I remember I had a professor, a very interesting guy, and he made an interesting comment. He said that I think I was the only Jew in the class at the time, at least the only visibly Jewish student in the class. So he said something about klezmer, which I thought was really interesting. He said klezmer, it's the new thing. Everybody, if you do go to Germany, you've got to go to some of these bars and pubs and some of these little theaters where they have these little klezmer orchestras, right? So klezmer in Hebrew, klezemer, literally means instruments of song or music. And he was telling me this was like the new fad in Germany at the time. And he made a very insightful comment, and he said, there's a very suspect philo-Semitism going on in Germany today. He was talking about the 80s and 90s. I think it's long gone, don't worry. But he said that there's a very suspect philo-Semitism in Germany right now, where he's saying basically, this is the culture that we almost destroyed, that we set out to annihilate. We were looking to completely, empty Europe of any Jews. And now there's this bizarre, nostalgic return to some of the Jewish culture that we almost killed and eradicated, as if to say maybe it's out of feelings of guilt, maybe it's out of curiosity, maybe it's a mix of the two. Very, very strange. Very, very strange thing. So he said it was interesting. He didn't know how long it was going to last, but that he and his friends used to have a good time going to these places. They enjoyed the music. It was a lot livelier than the German music was, and they enjoyed it that way. Well, the reality is that there are some very interesting stories if you follow, even in modern history, some of the, I don't know if you'd call it trends in conversion, but one of the interesting facts and features of conversion to Judaism is that the Germans in particular are very disproportionately represented in Beit Din. In fact, in Israel there was a period of time where there was a lot of discussion about this amongst people who knew and had their ear to the ground. It was really very interesting. A lot of people, I'll give you, it's an anecdote, but anecdotal evidence for what it's worth. When we bought our apartment in Israel, in Mitzpeh Home, the gentleman who did most of the finish work, we kind of bought these basically empty walls with basic plumbing and electricity, no floors, no tiles, no kitchen, no bathrooms. So a bunch of guys from the yeshiva, we got together and we got this guy who lived in the yeshuv in Mitzpeh Home to do the finish work for us. And he was kind of inescapably Aryan. It wasn't just the way he looked, he sounded a very thick German accent. As a speaker of German, I couldn't help myself. I said, "Tom." I threw him a couple of lines, a couple of questions. He refused to answer in German. He answered in thick, slightly broken Hebrew. And then as we got to know each other a little bit better, he explained to me that his paternal grandfather was a very active Nazi. He was the architect who designed and oversaw the construction of the death camp at Majdanek. And he was a very proud Nazi. In fact, after the war, he didn't take off the uniform. He went around looking for work and trying to show off. And look, this is the camp that I designed. I did what I could. Well, yeah. He's like, I had a budget. I would have done something much bigger and better if only they had let me, but I did what I could. We managed to kill 60,000. Maybe if they hadn't sent everybody to Auschwitz, I would have, accomplished more. So his father was humiliated by this after the war, and his father basically ran away from the family. In other words, this guy David's father wasn't born David, he adopted the name. So his father ran away from home, embarrassed by his own father's Nazi past, and he got married. He was kind of not really into religion, so as a mild atheist, but technically Catholic by birth, from southern Germany. He got married, they had 5 children. All 5 of these kids converted, they all live in Israel, they all lead Orthodox lifestyles. It's a fascinating story. And having spoken, now this guy himself, by the way, was an engineer and an architect, so it's not like the apple fell super far from the tree. In other words, he had a love for designing things and fixing things. And he was a little bit Kabbalistically inclined, this guy. And he told me that the same skills that he inherited from his grandfather, he wanted to put to constructive and productive use. So instead of using engineering and architecture in order to destroy the Jewish nation, he decided he wanted to help design housing units and apartments, specifically in the contested areas of the post-67 borders. The issue, he felt very close to this. The idea of the Jewish state not only subsisting, not only surviving, but actually expanding. And that's what he did. He worked at very reasonable prices, did excellent work. And it was very, very eye-opening. He was a lovely, lovely guy. Very interesting story. So how exactly do we understand this? I mean, obviously, halakha is halakha. And we don't have the right, the Gemara says very emphatically, we don't have the right to remind anyone, not a Baal Teshuvah, not someone who used to not be observant or once made a mistake or a bunch of mistakes and then came to repent and came to change their lifestyle, don't have the right to remind such an individual of his or her past. Oh, look at him, right? That's the guy who once, killed so-and-so, a drunk driver, or a guy who once got arrested for this, that, or the other offense. I mean, it's a terribly embarrassing thing to bring up. And the Gemara goes on and it says, you don't even have the right to mention this to someone who converted, even someone who converted from a famously, well-known non-Jewish background. What's it to you that someone's background should be Muslim or Christian or wherever it is? Who cares? What does it matter? When someone converts, you convert, that's it, you're part of the Jewish nation. All the halachot, all the obligations that we have. In fact, we have more obligations to someone who converted than do to someone who's born into the Jewish nation. When it comes to loans, when it comes to saving someone as a captive, when it comes to tzedakah, to actually giving gifts, offering assistance, we have an extra mitzvah to invite converts to the Shabbat and the holiday table, very literally to weddings, etc. So it's not like we care what an individual's background is or where they're coming from. It shouldn't be taken into consideration. Provided there's obviously no anti-Semitic sentiments left, shouldn't be taken into consideration as part of the process, or as evidence to be considered in the process. Why does it even matter? In other words, my question isn't so you can read the Gemara and you say, wow, that's fascinating. Look at that. So Haman and his descendants, and Sanherib and his descendants, and Sisera and his descendants, they all had feelings, some kind of connection to the Jewish nation, and they all somehow their descendants made it over. I wonder why we even bring it up. For that matter, Onkelos, if you're familiar with him, he's actually was Roman himself, who translated the entire Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, into Aramaic. He himself was a dignitary in the Roman Empire, and he's referred to just about everywhere as Onkelos Hager, like Onkelos the convert. So who cares? He converted. It was a one-time thing. He was one of the greatest of our sages. I mean, he was a luminary for generations to come. Why would the Gemara still refer to him as Onkelos the convert? Like, what pertinence, what relevance does it have? So,
well, in that case, it's also a merit for him. He came from nowhere, and he
came from nowhere. He came from the very empire that destroyed Beit HaMikdash. I mean, he was Italian. How much worse could it get? So, no offense to any Italians who may or may not be listening. So, Onkelos, in his case, we have to understand, obviously, that Chazal, the ones who gave us these directives, must have been exceedingly sensitive to this halakha, and if they mention it, it can only be as a way of merit. Imagine this. What merit the man has, that he came from a culture, the culture that devoted its time, its efforts, resources, its soldiers to destroying the Jewish nation, and to evicting them from the land of holiness, and he himself, as part of this empire, risked his life and limb, and went out and said, no, I want nothing other than to cling to this nation, to study from their Torah, and to become a part of them. And they sent group after group of soldiers and emissaries trying to bring him back, and he ended up converting them, and they just gave up on it. They said, fine, write it off, it's a loss. And that was it. So first of all, we must be referring to merit in some form or another. That's clear. We wouldn't be calling anyone, referring to anyone as a convert for any reason other than to praise them, because it would be a clear violation of halakha if we were to do otherwise. Still, on a deeper level, there's some kind of question that sort of begs itself. I mean, what do all these? I mean, these are anti-Semites of historic proportions, right? This isn't a useless Ahmadinejad or we're not talking about wimps or pipsqueaks or people. These are people who literally had the blood of hundreds of thousands of people on their hands. What's the mechanism? I mean, like, what goes through your mind when you make such a transition? So again, let's point out that it didn't happen in the same generation. Haman did not convert. Let's call a spade a spade. I mean, he was executed for doing what he did. But there was something apparently in him. I mean, his descendants are still associated with him, and they somehow found their way to Quran and to Judaism. So, well, if we were to put this, and we're notorious for doing this, putting this in our absolute value, those straight parentheses, you were to ask Haman on a scale of 1 to 10, if he feels really strongly about the Jews or if he's kind of neutral. So probably the answer would be pretty strongly, I assume. Who would... The man risked his own life. In fact, he died as a result of his vehement anti-Semitism. For him, death was better, was more desirable an alternative to trying to live with Jews in the world. So he clearly, his life was a second priority when it comes to his plan to annihilate the Jews. So he feels very strongly about them. Over the course of time, the strong feeling about the Jewish nation doesn't dissipate. It doesn't disappear. In other words, there's a very strong connection to Judaism, if you will. What was once manifest in something horribly negative and terribly destructive, all of a sudden sprouts as something super positive. It's something like the nation who studied Torah from these individuals, they had a connection to Torah and to Hashem that we envy. And so this is my master, come teach me, I want to learn how to be more like you. And it's impressive. So it's a very powerful concept. On this topic of individuals who are uniquely successful in destroying the world, there's a very, very powerful comment made by the Gemara elsewhere. Again, the chapter was opened here, and it was handed off to another tractate. This is Masechet Hagigah, famous discussion of the second chapter of Masechet Hagigah. It's a tractate that really, at least the first chapter of it is supposed to talk about one of the sacrifices that we're all obligated to bring when we make pilgrimage 3 times a year to Beit HaMikdash. And the Gemara makes another wonderful, bizarre comment. The Gemara says it's discussing a pasuk, it's a verse, in none other than Sefer Eov, the book of Job, which, by the way, tradition has it we study on Tisha BeAv. The overwhelming majority of it is bitter and somewhat, perspicacious, a little bit negative, got some perspective to it, and there's some positive chapters towards the end when he regains his footing. So the discussion there, the Gemara says it refers to a pasuk. The verse is وَأَشَرْ قُمُتُ وَلُعِتْ نَهَارْ يُتْزَقِ صَدَامْ. وَأَشَرْ قُمُتُ وَلُعِتْ, so qimet in Hebrew, quf mem tet, literally means a pleat or a fold. Well, I used to have. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They make pants, and that would you work in fashion. You take something that has a certain degree of material, and you want to reduce the material to a certain point, like around your waist, assuming that your waist isn't round. You just fold it, and so
Okay, no.
so folds are pinches. Yeah. So you pinch it, you take it up, and you can do this symmetrically, and it looks good. It makes the clothes a lot more expensive. So you have pleats. They call this in English pleats. You may never see that word again. And you have, wrinkles that you're trying to take out. Usually you do this with some kind of an iron, some kind of heat. So qimet in Hebrew means either a fold or a crease or some kind of a wrinkle. And so the pasuk reads like this. And again, it's one of these bombshells, and it's not easy to understand. وَأَشَرْ قُمَتُ وَنُعِتْ, and those who were creased or like folded out of time or without time, Nahar Yutzak Yisodam, right? A river is being poured. Mutzak could also be that it's like a molten river, like a river of molten melted metal. Nahar Yutzak Yisodam, like their foundation is in a flowing river of melted metal, molten metal. So the Gemara says, what's it referring to? This is referring to Tatqa'ad Dorot. Okay, Tatqa'ad, literally it's 974 generations that were folded out of time. Fine. 974 generations that were folded out of time. The Torah, according to the original plan, was meant to be given after 1,000 generations, except that the world was not able to exist without it. The wheels came off the wagon a little bit too quickly. And so, it was given after 26 generations, right? Same alphanumerical value was the name of Hashem, 26. 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, Abraham to Moshe, 6 generations, and there you go, the Torah was given. So what came of these 974 generations that were folded out of time, or creased out of time, so to speak? The Gemara says, easy. These are the Azei Panim Shabador. These are they were sprinkled, scattered out over the rest of the generations, and they are the most insolent, as if to say, the least disciplined, or the wildest members of the generation. Naturally, right? So you have, the original plan was for 1,000 generations, the world came off the handle a little bit too quickly, and so we have 974 generations that were, shortened out of time, or folded out of time, and then scattered over the subsequent generations. The Gemara goes on and it says, one opinion holds these are the most wicked members of every generation, another opinion holds no, these are the Talmidei Chachamim, these are the sages of each generation, and it's kind of left up in the air. It's a discussion that isn't really concluded. Okay, so again, this is easy. Nobody's eating, nobody gets spiritual indigestion from these discussions. So we have 974 generations that are supposed to be amongst the most powerful, incredibly capable human beings ever created, except there was a bit of a glitch in the deployment, and now what happens is that these individuals are, according to one opinion, exceptionally wicked, and they're the ones who basically contribute to the destruction of the world on a generation by generation basis. Or maybe they're the sages, they're the wise, righteous individuals who are the ones thanks to whom the world continues to exist, one generation after the other. How do you reconcile such wildly different opinions? We're going to have to revert back to our absolute value concept. So, if what we're talking about is sheer nishmatic power, we're talking about individuals that have capabilities, understandings, talents, skills. They have the ways and the means, so to speak, to turn the world inside out. Maybe some of them end up being tremendously wicked, and some of them end up being tremendously righteous. What's almost for sure, what's granted, it's a given, they're not going to grow up to be the little cookie-cutter kids that hold hands with everybody else and sing in class. That's not going to happen. When you have such nishmatic force, when you've got the engine of an 18-wheeler, there is no way that you're going to be born, educated, and then graduate out of the normative social institutions and come out your average ordinary citizen. It's just not going to happen. You're either likely to be exceptionally wicked or exceptionally righteous. What's almost guaranteed, what's almost for sure, is you're not going to end up anywhere in the middle. So on a scale of, let's say on the absolute value scale of 1 to 10, you're pushing 9 and upwards.
What's the word?
Nishmatic.
Oh, what's that?
It's a word I invented once that just means of or pertaining to the neshama. I don't know. English is a little bit limiting when it comes to the Torah. So nishmatically speaking. So when you consider this and you say, okay, I understand that there is a tremendous amount of force, a tremendous amount of power. Power is very difficult to harness. It's something that's very difficult to direct. Something that's difficult to control, right? Power and control are two very different things. We should not be surprised that these individuals are destined for an exceptional lifetime, an exceptional lifestyle. If you have a tremendous amount of power, and you're able to control yourself, you're able to harness the power, you're able to keep yourself focused, to avoid distractions, and to concentrate your efforts and your energy, your skills, your talents, your capabilities, you're going to achieve tremendous things. There's no limit to what you can do. You can study, you can review, you can excel, you can expend efforts that individuals normally can't expend, you can work longer hours, you can focus more, you can communicate better. You can literally save the entire world. Someone who has a tremendous amount of power, and for whatever reason that may be, finds it difficult to control themselves, how would you expect that to be manifest? Without getting into individual examples. How do you expect that to be manifest? Someone who has a tremendous amount of energy, a tremendous amount of capability, a tremendous skill or a tremendous talent, but the steering wheel's broken. So what would an individual like this look like? If I were trying to identify one, if I were to take my neshama meter, stick it in his or her ear, what would I expect the reading to come out as? I mean, how would this look if I take an individual like this, put him or her inside a classroom with the rest of the kids that we expect to be more or less normative, and here's someone with tremendous skills and tremendous energy and not so much control. Expect someone like this to sit still or be quiet, for example? Maybe. Would you expect someone like this to follow orders? Instructions? You know, do this, don't do that, stop doing this, do more of that? Maybe. Would you expect someone like this to be a bit opinionated? I don't know, have his or her own way of doing things? I mean, I would humbly suggest that yes, there's a little bit of room for individuality. See, at some point in life you realize that you're not like everyone else, and if you're very different from everyone else, then society has difficulty digesting that. It's not a new thing. I don't think we're any better at it now or any worse than we were in generations prior. Society is not very good at digesting exceptional people. Not exceptionally good people, not exceptionally bad ones. So we're all familiar with stories of you know, nutty professors, or of wacky people that had tremendous talents. In fact, if you look at people who were talented and accomplished a lot, very often you'll find they had extremely bizarre biographies. Right? Stephanie's here, so let's go music, right? Think Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, and Austria has a unique psychology to it, but still, they were very accomplished musicians, they were very talented individuals. They were profoundly bizarre, a lot of them. I mean, not that it was his fault. Was it Bach whose father was an alcoholic and beat him up and made him play for him as if he was in a bar, and come home and hit him until he learned how to play melodically. So, I mean, yeah, that leaves a scar. Mozart had some bizarre obsessions and compulsions, what have you, but they were very special people. So because they were bizarre, their accomplishments are worthless? Not necessarily. Because they were accomplished, it means their bizarrerie was a little bit more tolerable? Oh, they were pretty strange. You find this about a lot of, especially in the arts. The arts have a knack for drawing unique and talented people. Right, Vincent van Gogh is a good example of this. So he cuts off his ear. I get mad too. I'll be honest. You know, I don't cut off my own appendages, but I've been upset before. So for him, upset, it means something else. You know, it doesn't mean nuts. I had a bad day. Let me go post something on Facebook. It's like the world is coming to an end. You know, no one has ever suffered the way I'm suffering now, and I'm going to make that evident and manifest. So I'm going to mail a piece of my ear, the whole thing, to this ex-girlfriend of mine. Okay, so you're talking about extreme people. You're talking about extreme people. The Avidan chimes in on this, right, and leave it to the masters of the mystic to shed a little bit of light on an otherwise very abstract topic. The Arizal says that these are the individuals who were given the greatest neshamot available to human beings. In other words, as great as a person can be, the greatest neshamot, what a neshama means we'll have to discuss a little bit, but these are the bearers of the greatest neshamot of all times. And he says, make no mistake, the overwhelming majority of them were tremendously wicked people. Not that they were born wicked per se, but that society just doesn't know what to do with them. We don't know. We don't have schools for super gigantic, exceptional, nishmatic prodigies. How would you do it? And who would teach them, for that matter? Not me, an ordinary run-of-the-mill guy, to sit there and teach someone who's more intelligent than me at 5 or 6. I mean, I could try. It would be embarrassing. So you're talking about individuals who have tremendous potential, tremendous talents, tremendous capabilities, but society doesn't have the tools to handle them. And this is very interesting. He actually puts the responsibility, like the onus, the burden, on society itself. If we as a society were more capable of handling these people, we're better at understanding uniqueness, individuality, and leaving a little bit more room for self-expression, not for self-destruction or for genocide, but, you know, within reasonable limits, we might have been able to tap some of this tremendous talent and some of this tremendous ability if we were a little bit better designed, you know, to handle it and to kind of manage it. And the Arizal explains, look at all the tremendously wicked people throughout the Tanakh, and you'll find that they were all very capable people. Nowhere do you find anywhere in the Torah, in the Nevi'im, or in the Ketuvim, some imbecile who managed to do something evil and then had a verse or a chapter dedicated to him or her. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. It's not a book of imbeciles. We're not talking about simple, ordinary, everyday people. We're talking about exceptional people. But we have so many chapters that are devoted to people who are really crazy, who did very evil things. What is it that we have to learn from these evil people? So the Arizal explains, the logic would dictate that even these people had a tremendous passion. They had tremendous desires, they had tremendous appetites, and they were just poorly guided, they were poorly directed. And so if Haman has this appetite somewhere inside him, that he just wants to destroy, kill everyone Jewish, everything that reminds him of Judaism, right? With a bit of a subtle tweak, and it took a few generations, it wasn't him, it was his descendants. All of a sudden you can transform this tremendous appetite for connecting with the Jewish people and somehow controlling them and putting them under your influence, and instead of executing all of them, you want to teach them Torah. Come on, guys, you have a responsibility. It's embarrassing here. Get it together. Get your act, put one foot before the other, and get back on track. The rest of us have expectations of you. It's not right that you should leave us hanging like this. Okay, you haven't figured it out yet? I'll do it. I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. I'll send you some grandkids. They'll straighten it out. Tremendous appetite, tremendous capability. By the way, to teach the entire Jewish nation, good luck. Our prophets got killed in the process. Apparently they achieved something that even the prophets couldn't do. Zechariah was assassinated for rebuking the nation. And Haman and his grandchildren were somehow able to pull it off without getting killed. That's powerful. We're told they were prophets, but it's still impressive. And Sancherib, you could say almost the same thing. He has this desire to, mix it up, as if to say he wants to see what happens. He's got this almost a perverse curiosity. What would happen if I were to take the entire Jewish nation and scatter them into exile? Would they still be special? Would they still be individual? Would they still retain any semblance of an identity? I have to tell you, it's one of the most powerful lessons I ever learned when I was studying Stam, basically Jewish calligraphy when I was in yeshiva. That the Rav who was teaching us happened to be a neighbor of mine from downstairs, lovely, talented guy. So he told us, it's amazing. If you know anything about linguistics, anything about orthography and script and language systems, that the Ashkenazim and Sephardim can still read each other's Sifrei Torah after 2,000 years of exile. Perhaps even more in the case of Ashkenazim, because they've been in Germany since the first Beit HaMikdash. They didn't come back for the reconstruction of the second one. He said it's miraculous, absolutely miraculous, that the writing is not only intelligible, it's practically identical. Some angles and some corners versus rounded edges, but how tightly the language system was kept intact, despite the fact that we were in different cultures, with different religions, with different languages. You're talking about the difference between European language and Semitic language, so right to left to right, different pronunciations, different grammar and syntax and conjugation. And all of a sudden, after 2,000 or 2,500 years, I can pick up an Ashkenazi Sefer Torah and I can read it with the same fluency. I can read one from Morocco. It's an incredibly impressive thing. Sancherib has this bizarre obsession. Like, he wants to mix things up. The Jews are a special people. They're special because they're living in their own homeland and they have their own temple. And I'm curious to see what would happen if I were to scatter them all into the exile. And lo and behold, a lot of Jews are lost. And the identity of the Jewish nation is not. It's something that you can't defy. It's something that just will not quit. It won't give. And so we come back together, rebuild Beit HaMikdash. Some of the iniquities were perpetuated. Unfortunately, it didn't last longer than almost 400 years. But ultimately, his crazy, wicked experiment actually proved that there is something really unique and really special about the neshama of this nation that just won't be extinguished. It won't quit. And so you go down the list. Sisera was also, this is the time of the judges. This is before Beit HaMikdash was even built. But he was on a campaign. He was absolutely bent on killing as many Jews as he could. And thankfully, thanks to Yael, he was stopped. And nonetheless, apparently, and by the way, she explained, he had a daughter from her, because that's a famous story of seduction where she seduced him in order to tire him out. Then she crushed his head and killed him with a tent peg. So something about this process, about the mechanism, brings about some kind of refinement. Maybe that's the way we can put it. As if to say, it starts out in a very crude and difficult to control form, and over time, or over the generations, it kind of gets softened to the point that it's no longer too hot to handle. Like you can actually manipulate it a little bit. You can actually get positive, productive things out of it. Fascinating comment on the part of the Amshinov Rebbe. Amshinov Rebbe once said, I heard this from someone who heard it from him, from Dr. Yoshua Ritchie. He's a psychiatrist, lives in Yerushalayim right now. So he said that he once spoke to the Amshinov Rebbe, who told him, the Amshinov Rebbe lived in Yerushalayim. I think he came even before the founding of the state, but it was one of the few Hasidic movements that actually had a presence in Yerushalayim in the 40s and 50s. And people used to send to him from all over Israel, kids from religious families that weren't, marching lockstep with the rest of the kids in their class. The money was very tight, the state was very poor, and you only had so many schools, and what could you do with a kid who wasn't getting along with the rest of his classmates? A boy or a girl who was disruptive, or had bad habits, or was insolent, or arrogant, or defiant. I mean, how do you educate such a child? I've got 30 other kids in the class. What do I do with him? So the Amshinov Rebbe once said that it was a tremendous failure of our times. It was a failure of our generations that we don't know how to educate these kids. He said, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. You want to force 30 or 40 kids into a classroom. You expect them all to behave the same way. You throw them in like this is the ingredients for a cake. I expect everybody to behave together. Everyone's going to get along. They're all going to come out the same way and make the same size cookie. I mean, based on what logic? What in the Torah, in the Nevi'im, in the Ketuvim, in the oral, the written law, leads us to the conclusion that everybody's supposed to be educated the same way and come out the same way? So he said, what do you expect? Of course society rejects these kids. We don't have the utensils, the toolbox, to handle them or to get productive things out of them. And it's only because of our own shortcomings. And so he used to do, to the best of his ability, he would take these kids into his home, and he would study with them as a chavruta, on a one-by-one, one-on-one basis. Very often, he said, you'd come to the conclusion after studying with these kids that they're tremendous talents. They have potential. They're capable of enormous things. We're just not capable of giving them what they need in order to, blend into society, so to speak. So it's very interesting. We're used to seeing negative, horrible, cataclysmic or catastrophic periods of our history as all black. The reality is that what we had was a lot of competing ideologies, and we're familiar with this. The history speaks to political strife, to people unable to get along with each other, everybody pulling in their own direction or supporting their own leaders, their own rulers, or their own party leaders. When the reality is that we had a tremendous amount of potential. The Jewish nation never suffered from a lack of potential. There was never a lack of intellect, never a lack of talents. There was never a lack of people who did have the wherewithal, to bring things together, to get the message across, and to do what the nation needed. It's just that everybody was in conflict with each other. What we didn't have was the patience, we didn't have the tolerance to allow for more than one school of thought to develop and to grow. It's fascinating, by the way, that after the destruction of Second Beit HaMikdash, we're introduced, and not by accident, not by coincidence, to the period of the Mishnah. If you follow the chronology, the first Beit HaMikdash, we still have scripture, right? Don't forget the prophets that warned us about the destruction were obviously living at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. The first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed 70 years before the story of Haman, Esther, Ahashverosh, and Mordechai. Mordechai himself, along with a few of the prophets that were alive at his time, Daniel, was part of Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. What was actually born out of this period of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, the exile, the subsequent reconstruction, even though it seems like everybody knew this wasn't going to last forever, and it looks like the overwhelming majority of the nation didn't even bother to come back for the construction of the second Beit HaMikdash. It included the Ashkenazim, the Ethiopians, and the Temanim. Famously, the Ammonites, and even some of the Tunisians, let's be honest. No offense to any Tunisians who might be present to this.
Some Moroccans were there were in Morocco since the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed.
They had settlements. I don't know how consistently populated they were. Qirouan, for example, is in Tunisia. That we know for a fact. It's a community that predated, and also Jerba.
Jerba, they made the Griba, the old synagogue,
that's right.
with one of the stone of the first Beit HaMikdash.
So they'd been there since. They didn't come back, but nonetheless, So if you look back in the history through this, through these nishmatic goggles, let's say, what you end up with is the first Beit HaMikdash being destroyed, despite the fact that we had tremendous prophets. Right? You're talking about Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, Zechariah, some of the greatest prophets who ever lived. We had tremendous prophets, we had tremendous talent, and what we had was a tremendous amount of idolatry, believe it or not. People who believed in other things, who were looking for other powers, looking for other sources, other forms of guidance. I mean, the appetite was there for spirituality, but it was very corrupt. You had the destruction, which led to a 70-year exile. At the conclusion of this 70-year exile, we end up coming back to Israel, and all of a sudden the perspective changes a little bit. It changes a little bit. How little did it change? And Mordechai was one of the members of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. They began to, on the one hand, standardize things like prayers and blessings. So the Siddur, as we know it today, has its roots in Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. It goes back that far, the very beginning of the period of reconstruction of the Second Temple, the Ezra and Nehemiah. And at the same time, we have the standardization of a format for machloket. The standardization of a format for dispute. A format for dispute. It's fascinating. Remember when I was at YU, we were told a story that Dobrinsky was one of the head fundraisers at the time. So the Pope, the previous Pope, John Paul II, he came once. He sent a bunch of cardinals and bishops to visit. Cardinal Dolan, I think, was still serving at the time, to visit Yeshiva University. It was like a feel-good, PC kind of a mission. And so they came, and for the first time, the Pope comes and he visits a yeshiva, an active yeshiva. This is YU in its heyday in the late 70s, I believe it was. And they walk towards the main Beit HaMidrash. The main Beit Midrash is on Amsterdam and 186th. So he opens the door and he hears this loud noise coming out of the Beit Midrash. I can't even understand anything. He said, "What's going on over here?" And they said, this is the study hall. This is the Beit Midrash. This is where we study." And he said, "How could you study with so much noise? Everybody's yelling at each other. Everybody's fighting. Everybody's arguing." He says, "Who's the rabbi? Who's the teacher?" He says, "Oh, we have a few rabbis here." He said, "Where are they? Why don't they quiet the boys down?" "Quiet the boys down. They're fighting with them." So the rabbis are fighting with the boys are fighting back. This is a structure, this is hierarchy, this is how you can actually teach religious dogmas, by having the students fighting with their masters. So they said, "No, it's been this way for thousands of years. This is how Torah is taught and how it's studied." So he said, "Oh, must be a miracle. I don't know. It's something that I can't explain or something that I can't understand." But us, it works very differently. He said, we teach dogma, you have the master, you have the elders who teach you the way it is, and you learn, you study, and you teach the next generation. So I said, "No, by us, this is a fiery back and forth. It's a machloket." Another interesting anecdotal note, I once took a trip into Bavaria when I was in Switzerland for college. And there was a guy from one of my linguistics classes, a German linguistics class. Took me to visit his house in Nuremberg, home of the famous trials. And so while we're discussing, and we're talking a little bit back and forth about history, and inevitably, relatively recent history, there were some unpleasant topics of conversation. So he told me, "Yeah, we have a picture of my grandfather in a Nazi uniform. Nobody special, didn't really go anywhere. He was drafted, and that was pretty much it. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't going to conscientiously refuse to join the army." So I said to him, "What I'm really curious about as a student of linguistics and literature, what kind of expressions do you remember from your grandfather? That's what I really want, like the neshama of this people. Tell me, what do you remember your grandfather telling you about Jews and Judaism?" And so he said, "It's funny, he didn't really talk very much, my grandfather. There are two things that I can remember that he said about the Jews, in context." He said one of them was what he called Judeneile in German, which is like literally a Jewish hurry. A Jewish hurry. I don't know. I'm always busy, I've got things to do. So he said this is how his grandfather would refer to somebody who was running somewhere, like back and forth, or running, or getting errands done really quickly, running, checking his... This guy, Judeneile, like this guy, he rushes like a Jew. We Catholics, we have time. As we say, like our hearts calm, we can move. The Jews are always running like a chicken with its head cut off. We gotta get this done, gotta get that done. It's Rosh Shabbat. I gotta run. So he remembers this, like to be in a Jewish hurry. The other expression that he remembers was an expression his grandfather called the Judenschule, which is like a Jewish school. So I was like, "What does it mean to be a Jewish school?" He said, like when you walk past a bar or a restaurant, and people are shouting at each other, and they're shouting over each other, and you can't hear them, and you can't make them out. He's like, "My grandfather used to call that a Jewish school." He's like, it's noisy like a Jewish school in here. You can't hear yourself think, you can't hear yourself talk. You want to get something done, you have to step outside. Like, I don't understand how people... Apparently this was a linguistic thing. His grandfather wasn't a writer, which is that's the expressions that were in use in Bavaria at the time were a Jewish rush and a Jewish school. I'll never forget that. So interestingly enough, we fast forward to our times, to our generation, and you see that the roots of this more individualized education already start. They were sown at the beginning of the reconstruction of the Second Beit HaMikdash, when we have what? The standardization of a format of machloket. That's it. There are no more prophets. There are no more prophets. Prophecy has ceased. With God's help, it'll be renewed very quickly. What do we have? We have the period not of binah, not of intuition, where you can feel what it is that God wants you to do. We have the period of chokhmah, where you have to figure it out. We have the sources, we have the framework, we have the guidelines, but we need to duke it out. We need to work hard and figure out what are our priorities, what happens if the ideals conflict, what gets precedence over what, how do you actually determine who's a leader, who makes rulings, etc. And here, instead of people literally cutting each other's heads off and stoning each other to death, what we have is an open format for discussion. You need to be a sage to make it into the Mishnah, but once you do, your opinion is just as valid as anybody else's. We might hold like someone who's more prominent or someone we consider to be more learned or to have a greater breadth or depth of knowledge. But what we have is finally a format in which these disputes, these discussions are allowed to take form and allowed to take shape. Well, no offense, he would prefer to be in the period of prophecy. He wants to be in the period where, hey, God gave me a message, wake up everybody, here's what Hashem wants you to do. You don't have to like it. You can kill me if you want. Other prophets were killed too. But this is the word of God, and I refuse to step back.
Yeah, but
I refuse to back down.
The Yitzhara was much more bigger in the time of the prophecy.
True. People were in general on a higher nishmatic level, so the voltage was higher, and the risks were also higher. At the same time, the difference between nivuah and chokhmah, the difference between intuition and actual knowledge, actual wisdom, is ironically described in the Navi itself. Yeshaya himself says there will come a time, the reconstruction of Beit HaMikdash, where people will no longer need for one another to interpret the word of God, but rather each one is going to have his own prophecy, our own prophetic window, so to speak, to Hashem, which means what? It's a glorified prophetic machloket. That means that it's not so simple. We won't necessarily be looking forward to a time where one prophet gets up and says, here's the word of God, you need to observe it, and tough luck if you don't like it. But rather what we're hoping for, what we're striving for is a situation in which each and every one of us maximizes our own potential. We reach the highest level we can possibly reach. We understand the Torah, the angles of it that we're nishmatically fortunate enough to be able to understand, and we can live our lives accordingly. So the beginning of the reconstruction of Beit HaMikdash, the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash, the very fact that we have a format that allows for discussion and dispute, that we allow legitimacy on both sides of the argument, sometimes 3, 4, or 5 sides of the argument, that the sages in question are able to dispute, to argue, to try to validate, invalidate, to try to prove, back up, bring sources, etc. This is a world of a difference from the first Beit HaMikdash, from the first temple. And if you will, Stephanie, in nishmatic terms, what does it mean? It means that, the bridle has come off, so to speak. We're actually now working as hard as we can to reinstitute this concept of nishmatic sensitivity. People learn differently. People behave differently. People will grow and develop differently. And as long as it's within the confines of halakha, it's perfectly legitimate, it's perfectly normal. In fact, our redemption depends on it.
We need the differences.
We desperately do. If it were all about everybody being uniform, and by the way, the irony is that the two had to come together. In other words, along with Anshe Knesset HaGdolah came the standardization of tefillah. And it's a difficult concept to explain to people. I want to pray to God. I mean, who's to stop me from composing my own prayers? So I say the same thing I say to aspiring chefs. Who's to stop you from cooking whatever you want? Is someone else going to eat it or pay for it? Not necessarily. But you can experiment, you can tinker, you'll figure it out. It takes a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of understanding, a little bit of, let's say, if not prophecy, I mean at least appreciation, understanding of prophecy to know the framework, the context. How do we address God? How do we expect God to respond to us? So maybe prayer is not for every Tom, Dick, and Harry to compose. So what they did was they set the general framework within which halakha requires us to function, and at the same time we have a clean, neat, and relatively easy to use format for disputations, for arguments, for the support or detraction from different legitimate opinions. And they're recorded for posterity. It's not like we went around sifting only the answers that we wanted to hear, the ones that we accepted. We went ahead and recorded even the opinions that were rejected from halakha. Beautiful Mishnah, Masechet Eduyot, can't repeat this enough. Mishnah says, why is it that we record both the opinion of the rabbi who won the argument, so to speak, and the one who lost? Why do I need both opinions? It makes the Mishnah 2 or 3 times longer than it needs to be, and it's already long enough. The answer is, so no wise guy should wake up in our generation and say, you know what? The sages were as wise as I am. They would have taken this, that, or the other thing into consideration. They would have seen this from this kind of an angle. Maybe if they had studied more science or more philosophy, more astronomy, they would have realized, just like I do, that the truth should be such. And so the Mishnah says, no, this opinion was once considered and summarily rejected. We keep it there for posterity, so no one should come up and try to reform Judaism by saying, hey, they got it all wrong. If they knew this, they would have thought like me, and we'd all be praying to a different God. So the individuality of the neshama, the nature of, especially those individuals who have neshamatic capabilities, who have potential, who have the strength, the intellect, the intuition, to make a tremendous connection to the non-physical world and to bequeath at least a little bit of it to the rest of us, makes for choppy seas. It makes for difficult sailing. In most cases, as the Arizal says, we rejected these neshamot, and they became tremendously wicked people who contributed more to the destruction of the world than they did to the perpetuation of Hashem's creation. At the same time, it's one of the promises, or maybe one of the indications of the redemption, that individuality kind of comes back into play, that we're able to take into account legitimate halachic, viable halachic opinions, to negotiate them civilly and respectfully, and to learn and appreciate the point of view of another perfectly valid neshama that has just that should have as equal a right and equal a say to comment on these spiritual concepts as someone else of the same stature. We hope that Kadosh Baruch Hu should open our eyes in His Torah, should give us the strength to admit that others know a lot of things that we don't, and hopefully to conduct ourselves in our halachic and spiritual debates and disputes in a civil and spiritually constructive manner. So,